It's the 29th of July and welcome to PHDQ's. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I was conducting marine assurance activities on behalf of my employer. I will be conducting further such activities this afternoon. Question 1 comes from Ewan from Edinburgh. He is a member of the SNP Edinburgh Central Branch and asks which candidate you should go for, Angus Robertson, Joanna Cherry. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a great question. Firstly, I'd advise you to have a look at who else is standing. I'm not sure if there is a third or even fourth person interested, but just because these two big hitters are, doesn't mean that they should be a shoo-in. However, both of these candidates are fine politicians, and Edinburgh Central would be fortunate to have any of them in Holyrood. Either of them is capable of winning the seat, and given who they're looking to succeed, it might be advantageous if the party did select, a big hitter. Angus was very effective as an MP, and as our leader in Westminster until 2017. He's a big team player. Having led the team, he understands how important that is. Joanna is a great speaker and a sharp, analytical legal mind. Hardly surprising, I suppose. She is a QC. But she is a wee bit rebellious and would noise up Holyrood a bit. Not that I think that would be a bad thing. I'm going to say I would go with Angus, and these are the reasons why. Whilst it is permissible for a person to serve as an MP and MSP, I feel either is a full-time job. I feel like someone serving as both would have to leave one behind to do it full justice. Gaining Joanna at Holyrood would be great, but assuming she resigned her Westminster seat, that would then open us up to a by-election, which is an unnecessary risk. Assume all that went to plan. All we've then achieved is to take Joanna, shift her from Westminster to Holyrood. Now, if we can bring Angus back into frontline politics, we can have them both fighting for the cause. And finally, in a worst case scenario, if Angus contested the seat and lost it, it's less of a hit for the party. And Joanna, currently a sitting MP, isn't humiliated by losing an election. Now, ultimately, it's for the local membership to decide. But if I were there, the safe bet for me would be Angus Robertson for Edinburgh Central. But that's not saying anything negative about Joanna Cherry. Both are fine parliamentarians. Getting Angus into Holyrood is the only way we can come out ahead. And in the worst case that he loses and Joanna stays put, we at least tread water. Joanna will have a seat in Holyrood soon enough, when we leave the UK. Question 2 comes from J.R. Mogg of Somerset. Why should public money be spent on an SNP political broadcast? I can only assume that Mr. Mogg is inferring that the First Minister's briefings are winning her fans and possibly even votes. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say I find this question unsurprising. Mr. Carlaw from the Scottish Conservatives has already voiced his displeasure over the internet, and Mrs. Bailey from Scottish Labour has complained to the BBC. To both of them, I would say this. Miss Sturgeon has repeatedly at the lectern said she is focused on COVID-19 and that alone. She has not tried to score political points whilst briefing the nation and still won't. If she has scored any, I'd venture it's from her calm and assured performance, both at the briefings and leading our country through this crisis. Now, both of these people are experienced enough to know that the BBC is under no obligation to broadcast these briefings. If the BBC didn't deem them newsworthy, they wouldn't cover them. To Mr. Carlaw, it's a strange coincidence that this wasn't an issue until your boss in London realised that he wasn't scoring any points with his. In fact, he was probably costing himself said points, so has stopped doing them. If Mr. Carlaw feels sore about this, I'd suggest that he books a venue, gets a sign language interpreter, and gives his own take. I wonder how many political points Mr. Carlaw would score, Mr. Speaker. To Miss Bailey, I look forward to her letter of complaint to the Prime Minister and the Royal Air Force. Mr. Johnson used public money, a government aircrew and aircraft to travel to Scotland for blatant, if ineffective, campaigning. Surely that's a waste of public money too. I'd ask Miss Bailey to post images of said letter online when she gets round to sending it. Question 3. Doris for the Broch asked, Fitz happening with Spain. Well, Mr. Speaker, as you know, a few weeks ago our UK established an air bridge with Spain. Scotland followed suit 2 weeks later. Though Spanish deaths per capita remain lower than the UK, some areas of the country are experiencing rises in localised infection rates. Now, the UK government can't just isolate a region, as people could travel internally to another one to avoid it. So that means they've had to withdraw the air bridge between the UK and Spain. But to be honest, Mr. Speaker, I believe there's more to this story. I think the air bridges were a terrible idea. Given that Spain had a lower infection rate than ours before it was established, and the areas most affected are tourist areas, it's highly likely that UK tourists are the cause of the rise in infections. Also, given the incubation period, it's more likely to have been those who travelled from our UK airports. From the UK side, establishing an air bridge looked like a great idea. The promise of a cheap, swift holiday must have been appealing after months of oppressive lockdown. But from the Spanish side, and all the other countries, I probably wouldn't have accepted the offer of an air bridge, given the continued R number and fatality rates in the UK. It's also true that returning passengers are not being well enough monitored to ensure they are complying with self-isolation. They're passing through the airports as usual, getting out onto public transport, getting into taxis, etc., exposing the rest of us. This is just the latest in a catalogue of border control issues that have not been very well handled at all. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's it for PHDQs this week. I direct the watching public to comment on the Facebook page. Remain civil at all times. DaviePHD.